Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à Montréal et à l'École Max Bell de Politique Publique. My name is Chris Reagan. I am an economics professor and the director of the Max Bell School. Canadian prime ministers and other policymakers have long known that one of the most important objectives for Canada is to maintain and strengthen our historic relationship with the United States. There are several domestic policy issues where what is happening in the United States actually matters quite a lot, including corporate taxation, environmental protection, Arctic exploration, water resources, transportation, and other things. And on the foreign policy front, there is nothing more important to Canada than making sure that we understand the US position, and unless there's a very good reason for deviating, which sometimes happens, for ensuring that our policy position is aligned with theirs. Nowhere is this more relevant today than on the issue of an ascendant China, which is the theme of today's conference. Now, this conference is the second conference in what I hope will become a long and successful series of conferences and other events, advancing our knowledge about the many aspects of the Canada-US relationship, jointly sponsored by the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and the Max Bell School of Public Policy. This collaboration is the result of a generous gift from Mr. Ken Slater and his family, and I want to take this opportunity to thank him, even though he was unable to make it to today's event. Ken Slater is a principal of Tremont Partners. He's a very proud McGill alum, and the Max Bell School is delighted to have him as a benefactor. Both Canada and the United States need a go-to institution for policymakers to meet and interact with experienced and savvy policy thinkers to advance effective and practical policy in the many complex aspects of the Canada-US relationship. There's very little that goes on in either country where better knowledge of what's happening in the other country doesn't result in better decisions, better policy, and better social and economic outcomes. It is my hope that this partnership between the Max Bell School and the Wilson Center can produce a concentration of expertise that can be of benefit to the people in both countries. So let me close by thanking the organizers of this conference. And first, very top of the list is Vincent Rigby, who is a Slater Family Professor of Practice at the Max Bell School. He has been working hard for several months putting this all together, and I want to recognize his huge efforts on this front. I hope this experience has not scarred him irrevocably for future conferences, roughly a year from now. I also want to thank Chris Sands from the Wilson Center, with whom Vincent has been collaborating on this conference. So that's more than enough for me. We have a great program for you today and an impressive group of panelists, and I'm excited to hear the upcoming discussions. So let me pass the microphone to Vincent Rigby for his comments about setting the stage for today's discussions. Thank you very much.
So 30 years in the public service left enough scars on me, so I don't think I can get any more, quite frankly. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Fabulous, fabulous turnout. And they often say that conferences, their ultimate success begins and ends with the people who are in the room and who are up here as panelists. And we just got an amazing group of people that we've pulled together. We've got practitioners, former practitioners, we've got academics, we've got scholars, we've got sinologists, we've got Canadian foreign policy experts, defense policy experts. It's the right group of people who are here to have this discussion today on China. So we're really excited, and we think it's going to be a very special day. I don't think I need to explain to this crowd why we chose China as the topic for the second Slater conference. We talked about the Arctic at last year's conference, but even then, I think, Chris, you and I were saying maybe we should lead off with China. We delayed it 1 year. There's an abundance of riches in terms of other topics that we could have chosen. War broke out in the Middle East. We had an ongoing war in Ukraine, et cetera. But we just felt that it kept on coming back to China and an ascendant China. It is just a country that really you cannot have a conversation about global issues these days. You cannot have a conversation about the Canada-US relationship without China really coming to the fore. I like to say that in any discussion nowadays, in any room around the world on international issues, China is really the 800-pound panda bear. It's there. And we had long conversations about what to call this conference. The working title was Canada, US, and an Emerging China. And Robert Daly from the Kissinger Institute, who is somewhere out there, correctly pointed out, China is not emerging. China is not rising. It has emerged, it has risen. So hence the word ascendant. They are there, and they're front and center, and we know all the reasons why they're front and center. And for Canada and the US, I mean, even though there is a war in the Middle East, even though there is a war in Europe, you cannot open a newspaper these days in the United States without the front page screaming out a headline about the China-US relationship. It is right at the top of their foreign policy agenda. And increasingly in Canada, it's become part of our national security foreign policy agenda, whether it's been the two Michaels, foreign interference, which has been playing out over the last year, including through the public, the panel. Sorry, Malcolm Brown, my former boss, just stepped in the room, and of course I immediately get nervous when Malcolm's in the room, so I had to point you out, Malcolm, I'm sorry, I just... So I would suggest that Canada's position with respect to China has evolved over the last couple of years, and now it has become a really serious bilateral issue between the two countries with the US. So we tried to pull together an agenda today that captures a lot of the issues in our respective relationships with China, which capture a lot of the issues around China as an ascendant power, whether it's on the security front, whether it's with respect to human rights, trade, technology, commerce, etc. It's a jam-packed agenda. There's a lot there. There's some overlap between the various panels, but we think we got the makings of a good conference here. And we hope it's not just going to be another China conference. I think there are two reasons why it will be a little bit different and special, as I say. First of all, is that it's a China conference, but it's also a Canada-US conference. So as Chris made clear at the outset, this is very much about the Canada-US relationship. So as we look at those jam-packed panels, we look at the issues that are going to be discussed throughout the day, please, can you try and look at them through a Canada-US lens or a Canada-US prism? We are looking to find out, for Canada and the US, both in terms of how they perceive China, but also how they respond to the China challenge, where there's convergence and where there's divergence. Where can we work more effectively together in responding to that China challenge? Where are we doing well already? And so we want that to be front and center. And not everybody's necessarily a Canada-US expert, but just in teasing out the issues through the course of the day, we'll see areas where the US is doing a little bit better, and maybe in other areas Canada's doing a little bit better, however we want to define better. The second issue is that we very clearly decided at the outset we did not want this to be just another typical China conference in the sense of it being a China bashing. So it's not really about the China threat and containing that threat, constraining it, challenging it, and competing with China. Lots of words that begin with C there. There are other C words, such as compromise, cooperation, coexistence. So the last panel of the day that Jeff Nankerville, who you're going to get to know well, is going to be chairing, is about that cooperative space, potentially with China, for Canada, the US, and other Western powers. But I'd like to hope that throughout the day, we have that in the back of our mind, even on hardcore security issues where there may be some space where we can work more closely with China. So with those two themes, I hope it'll make the conference a little bit different. Just a couple of housekeeping points. A number of you come up to me and said, oh, this is Chatham House rules, right? I can say whatever the hell I want to say. You can say whatever the hell you want to say, but it's not Chatham House rules. You are here by invitation. We didn't open up to the public. Not anybody can just walk in here. But at the same time, we are going to record it and we are going to put it online later. So please keep that in mind, especially with some of my former colleagues from the public service and what you want to say today. We've got great staff, great support here. Just want to call out several people. Adriana Garetta, I don't know if she's here. She's probably in the other room. Weston and my two research assistants, Gag and Gill, and Michael Finkelstein. Oh, you're right there. They've been fantastic Max Bell students. And you will see a bevy of Max Bell students here today who have arrived en masse. They'll be in and out. They've got busy schedules. A lot of them will be seeking you out, looking for jobs. Heads up, they've got my full support, and I will be pointing them in your direction. So wait for it. One of the best things about my job at Max Bell is working with the Wilson Center. I've had tremendous fun working with Robert Daly and with Chris Sands. I'm going to pass the podium over to Chris. I don't think he needs a lot of introduction. I think everybody in this room knows him. Head of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center, and I would say the foremost U.S. expert on Canada-U.S. relations. He would probably respond, there aren't a lot of experts on Canada-U.S. relations in the United States, but you're it, Chris, and you're the best. He's so prominent in this field that I think you like to joke that people think you're a Canadian. I think he's Canadian just because he's super nice and he's great, really easy to get along with. But over to you, Chris.
There's not too much to say that hasn't been said, except that I echo the sentiments that the Wilson Center has found a great partner in Max Bell, and we're really grateful to the Slater family for giving us the opportunity to build this relationship and make it stronger. One of the sort of mid-20th century poets from New Jersey, and that's a small category also, William Carlos Williams, starts a poem with, "Well, shall we speak or listen? Is there a sound addressed not wholly to the ear?" And I think that's somewhat captures what we're here to talk about. I'm going to be having my anniversary this summer. We married for 15 years, and I don't know if any of you have had the same experience, but sometimes I get really interesting stories about what my wife's doing and thinking when we go out with another couple. But if we were just sitting on the couch, we don't bother. And so I feel like sometimes that you need that other presence to bring out the stories and to get to know each other better. And for us today, China is that other presence. Canada, the United States, we've talked to death. We know each other so well. We sit on the couch and watch TV. And then China comes up, and we start to tell our good stories, and we start to understand how we understand that each other through that third partner. And that's been the idea behind these conferences last year on the Arctic and this year on China, and also the Indo-Pacific, which I think is important to be part of that context. It's a very important region for us all. And with that, I'm going to say thank you again, but also invite the next panel to come on up, and we'll get started right away, including with the great moderator, another of my wonderful Wilson colleagues, Shihoko Goto, who's the director of our Indo-Pacific program at the Wilson Center. Come on up.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chris, for that great introduction, and thank you to the Max Bell School of Public Policy. It's such a great honor for me to be here today to moderate a discussion about regional security in the Indo-Pacific. And I want to start by trying to achieve three goals today. One is to define what exactly the threat is. And what do I mean by that? To define how China is actually a threat to the security of the Indo-Pacific. A threat economically, a threat militarily, a threat politically as well. And then second, to identify whether and how Canada and the United States diverge in managing this risk as strategic competition between Washington and Beijing become entrenched. And then thirdly, prospects for Canada and the United States to build up partnerships and networks across the Indo-Pacific, especially in South and Southeast Asia, in an attempt to avert Chinese military aggressions and stop Beijing from abusing its economic might. So these are very, very big goals. It's a very big topic. I think we can really spend a great deal of time on each of these. But I have a great panel that is more than up to the task of really delivering succinctly, and we can move forward as the day goes forward. From my right, I believe there is a more detailed biography of each speaker online, but if I may briefly say, from my right is Janice Stein, who is the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Last year, she co-chaired the National Advisory Committee on Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy for the Minister of Global Affairs. Next is Vice-Admiral Angus Topshee. He is the 38th Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. He commanded Canada's Pacific Fleet from 2018 to 2021. Next is Dr. David Finkelstein, who is the Vice President and Director for China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs at the Center for Naval Analysis based in Arlington, Virginia. He is a former member of the U.S. Army, and he has held numerous key positions in shaping U.S.-China relations, including as advisor to the Secretary of Defense. And then finally, we have Travis Whitworth, who is Senior Director of Global Intelligence at Strider Technologies. He joined Strider after 22 years at the CIA, focused on East Asia, and has served multiple tours in CIA stations across the Indo-Pacific. So what a great lineup of people. If I can get the conversation going, Vice-Admiral Topshee, I'd like to start with you to define, if you could explain to us, how does Canada define the threat that China poses to security in the Indo-Pacific? And as we see the rise of multilateral partnerships on the security front, from the expansion of the Quad to the rise of AUKUS, what role does Canada play in deterring Chinese military action?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. In the military, when we look at a threat, we look at two things: capability and intent. And when it comes to China, the capability is quite clear. There is no doubt that they've been growing the PLA Navy very aggressively. 12 shipyards right now. It is currently the largest by ship numbers Navy in the world. The U.S. Navy is still the most powerful, but China is rapidly developing capabilities across the spectrum of naval warfare. And then the other critical capability from a state perspective is a fairly significant expansion of their nuclear arsenal, including developing a triad very similar to what the U.S. has, which is unusual because prior to that, they had what they believed was a minimally sufficient deterrent, right? So just enough nuclear weapons to deter anyone. And they've changed that posture to what more we see with Russia and the United States. But intent is the really difficult thing to measure. The question is really, they have this military force. They're growing it even further. What are they going to do with it? They're building a Navy that is capable of power projection. They've got their new aircraft carrier, which is a slightly smaller, but getting on par with the latest U.S. carriers, the Ford class. That allows them to go around the world, but we haven't seen any evidence of what exactly they would like to do with that. What we can see is in the South China Sea, the aggression towards the Philippines and the Second Thomas Shoal, the assertion of the 9-dash line, the building of islands and the militarization of putting missiles, defensive forces onto those islands. All of that's there, but you can still make the case that it would be logical to defend themselves and to ensure that the U.S. couldn't threaten them coming into the South China Sea. So you can make a case either way. I know that my American counterparts are quite convinced that China will be in a position to invade Taiwan by 2027, and the U.S. Navy is working very hard, and the Marine Corps as well, to make sure that they are prepared to deter and counter any such effort by that time. I think it's really hard to know how serious President Xi is about such a move. Having the capability does not imply the intention to use it, because as we know, it can be the threat of it can be sufficient to achieve a person and perhaps to achieve a purpose and perhaps get concessions in another area. The interesting thing is the perspectives of the other countries in the region, specifically Japan, the Republic of Korea, Australia increasingly. Japan's growth of their defense budget is quite considerable. They are building a much larger Navy as well. They have moved to put F-35s onto their helicopter destroyers, building aircraft carriers for the first time since the Second World War, fairly significant expansion of their fleet. Republic of Korea increasingly seems to be more concerned about China than about North Korea, and wants to make sure that they've got a powerful force ready to work in the region as well. And then Australia. The AUKUS decision and the commitment to nuclear submarines is an incredibly expensive decision. You're looking at something where it will be at least $11 billion over a year until 2055 and beyond. They've already paid $3 billion US into the US submarine maintenance program. And that's a substantial investment into another country's ability to maintain their deterrent. All of that's done with an eye towards deterring and protecting themselves against China. So there's a clear perception of a potential threat. The challenge, I think, now is to figure out do we make it more likely that we will have a war by acting as though we need to be ready for such a war? And we can create this self-fulfilling prophecy of war with China if we're not very careful. So I think it's really important that we find ways to continue to have dialogue with China. And that is something exceptionally difficult in this polarized world we're in right now, where it seems as though there is no space for compromise, no space for accepting anything less than the stereotypical vision of this is evil and this is good, when the reality is always in between those two extremes. For myself, I recently visited China to attend the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. That's an organization with 23 member states around the Pacific Rim, and is dedicated towards trying to achieve dialogue. The biggest achievement of it is it's what's called CUES, the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea. It's how you govern the interactions of two Navy ships that come across each other and how you can signal what you actually intend to do. And it has been broadly quite successful. In fact, most of our encounters in the Royal Canadian Navy with the people at PLA Navy have been very professional. You know, just as we would if a Chinese task group came into our waters off the coast of British Columbia, we would sail our ships out there to see what they were doing and to keep an eye on them. And so it's not surprising that the PLA Navy does exactly the same when any non-Asian ships come into their vicinity. And so there is always a PLA Navy ship in the vicinity of any Canadian ship operating in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. If we go through the Taiwan Straits, they follow us through. None of that is surprising. And what's important to me is that the interactions are safe and professional. That has not been the case when it comes to air intercepts of our maritime patrol aircraft and some of our helicopters. So we've expressed concerns. There have been demarches to China about that, and we'll monitor that very carefully. But, by and large, the relationship seems to be stable and understandable. There's a reason why we're doing the things we do. Our intention is to continue to demonstrate our ability to operate in that part of the world, to understand that region. Under the Indo-Pacific strategy, we're committed to sailing 3 frigates a year into Indo-Pacific, and we're going to evolve to a persistent presence, meaning instead of sending 2 ships at the same time, we're probably going to try and have 1 frigate there throughout the year. So right now, HMCS Montreal is about to go through the Suez Canal, head into the Indian Ocean and around into the Pacific. Later on, Vancouver will sail to do the Rim of the Pacific exercise in Hawaii, and then we'll go into Indo-Pacific. And finally, HMCS Ottawa will deploy over Christmas period and into the new year, and then we'll continue that cycle so that there's always a Canadian ship in the region to demonstrate our presence, to demonstrate our commitment to that rules-based international order and the free and fair use of the oceans to the benefit of all. And so that's our approach, to try and sort of demonstrate that we can all work together, we can all be in the same places, and we can continue to do so peacefully. So the answer, I haven't really answered your question. It's, China is a potential threat, but hopefully not.
Thank you so much for that very thoughtful response. And just a comment and maybe a follow-up question, if I may, before I turn it over to David. Words matter in this. Words matter, and I was actually in Bangkok a couple of weeks ago, and when I started talking about the China threat, there was a lot of pushback from those who across Southeast Asia, saying that if you call China a threat, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, and that perception is not necessarily shared across the board. One question I do have is about Canada's direct engagement. So we talk about, you mentioned AUKUS, there's the Quad. Canada's not part of either. It is an integral part of NATO. There is no collective defense mechanism in the region, but at the same time, we've had 4 countries, namely Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, become permanent observers to NATO. We've also had talks about perhaps NATO should have an office in Tokyo. That was, there was a lot of pushback from the French on that. What is the role, if any, for NATO in the region? And conversely, is there an opportunity for greater collective defense mechanisms in the region?
Yeah, so NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific is a fascinating one. So as I frequently remind Admiral Bauer, who's the chairman of the military committee, NATO has a western flank in the Pacific. And so I am on the hook as the commander of the Canadian Navy to deploy 5 frigates in response to NATO, should NATO execute Article 5 and Canada find itself at war as a result. As I've told Admiral Bauer, is like, don't assume those 5 frigates will be in the Atlantic, because it's probably about Russia, and they have a Pacific base, a Pacific fleet, and a Northern fleet, and I will be protecting those 2 flanks with our frigates. So NATO is in the Pacific in that sense. A more formal role is interesting. The biggest strength that NATO offers is interoperability. The fact that the 32 member states have all agreed that this is how we will operate. If I need to call up another ship, there's procedures to do so. I can very, very rapidly integrate into that. And so the benefit of bringing in the partner countries into the Pacific is that they start to be brought into that. We share a lot of NATO publications with them to create that common ability to operate together. I don't see a future for a defense arrangement, a formal defense arrangement of the scope and size of NATO. However, there already are a number of them. There's the 5 Powers Defense Agreement with Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and the UK, and New Zealand, I believe. There is, a defense agreement between the Philippines and the US that is actually potentially quite difficult with Second Thomas Shoal if that gets triggered by China's actions there. There are security arrangements with Japan and the US, Republic of Korea and the US, a number of different things. And so the interlocking and interplay of all of these can be quite complex. So there is, of sorts, a security regime in the region that I think provides a hodgepodge of different security guarantees that can add complexity. And the other thing I'll note is that the United States, Canada, we have allies. China hasn't really got allies of the same things. They have a relationship with Russia. They have a relationship with North Korea, but these aren't alliances of the type. When we look at the exercises they do, they're not at the same level of what we do with our allies and partners in the region. So China, I think, to a certain extent, is isolated a bit in that regard. And so again, it becomes really important not to make that something that forces them down a certain path, to find a way that this doesn't create a World War I scenario where all of these overlapping alliances lead us to conflict as opposed to deterring it.
Great. Thank you. All right. So, David, if I may turn to you now. Assuming that the strategic competition with China will reshape the global order, how does the United States define victory towards China? And what is the end goal? And how do we get there? And what is U.S.-Canada cooperation in achieving this common agenda?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to be here in beautiful Montreal. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I must say that I have a warm place in my heart for the Canadian Armed Forces. Many decades ago, when I was a young platoon leader, I got to do a platoon exchange. We went from Arizona on the Mexican border in February to Ottawa, and one line troop of the 1st Canadian Signal Regiment went down to the American desert. I think they got the better of us, but I did learn how to curl. So I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for that opportunity. I've been dealing with the PRC and the PLA for over 4 decades, and I only mention this to say that, or admit, that I've never been less certain than I am today about what goes on in China. I think that China under Xi Jinping is a very different beast than anything any of us have been used to dealing with. And under Xi, the military element of national power in China has finally come online, and the party, as the Admiral alluded to, is employing the PLA in ways that are often problematic for others, whether on its border with India, in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, where the Royal Canadian Navy has had some firsthand experience, whether in combined out-of-area naval operations with Russians and Iranians in the Indian Ocean off the Red Sea, in demonstrations of force around Taiwan, or the establishment of, and this is quite remarkable, China's first overseas military base in Djibouti, overturning a long-held tenet of Chinese foreign policy that Beijing will never have an overseas military base. And of course, as you read all of the Chinese materials, which, by the way, will do bad things to your head, so don't spend too much time doing it. But you come to find out that the military element of national power is integral to Xi Jinping and the party's vision for the, quote, great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And as the CCP slogan goes, in rough translation, the China dream is also the dream of a strong military. So, In 1979, when Washington and Beijing first established diplomatic relations, the Chinese military had lost an entire decade of modernization because of the great proletarian cultural revolution, and the PLA Navy was nothing more than a brown water coastal defense force, and one that encountered all sorts of problems in their last conflict operationally with the invasion of Vietnam. And if you fast forward 4 decades later, the Pentagon is now talking about the Chinese military as the U.S.'s, quote, pacing challenge, referring to the Chinese military as a near-peer competitor, and it is a competitor that, to a large degree, is driving U.S. military modernization programs, doctrinal innovation, and force posture decisions in the Indo-Pacific. And, you know, the Admiral made reference to the fact that the PLA Navy is getting larger. We could also talk, but we won't, about the fact that the Chinese nuclear force is expanding and enhancing its survivability, and the fact that since 2016, the PLA has been undergoing a historic and sweeping reorganization meant to better position itself to fight as a joint force. And of course, they're focusing on what they call emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, the use of outer space, hypersonics. And just 10 days ago, there was another reorganization of the PLA in which an information support force was established. So today, really, for the first time in the history of the People's Republic of China, the PLA can offer the party's civilian leaders a range of warfighting options across the spectrum of conflict that they really didn't have in the past, from non-traditional security, non-combatant evacuation operations and anti-piracy, through large-scale conventional war, and also, God forbid, to nuclear war. We're dealing with a very different PLA than we're used to under a party regime that is something of a unique beast, and of course, Xi Jinping has shown some proclivity to be more risk tolerant. So, and if this is problematic for the United States, it's even more problematic for the countries of Asia, because now they are living not only in the shadow of the world's second largest economy, upon whom they rely for their economic well-being to a certain degree, but they're also living under the shadow of the world's second largest military. And so there's both the velvet glove and the mailed fist with China that they're having to deal with. And so, you know, from a U.S. perspective, you know, how do you boil down the fact that for the first time in almost 4 decades, there is now a military component to the strategic tensions between Beijing and Washington? That wasn't really there until the last 10 years. It's always been economic tensions, trade frictions, human rights problems. But over the last 10 years, the military dimension of competition has become come to the forefront. So I would boil it down to this, and then I'll talk about the U.S. and Canada for just a moment. So the U.S. joint force seeks to ensure, as it always has, that now and in the future, it will continue to be able to deploy and strike at will across the Pacific in defense of U.S. vital interests and those of its allies and partners. So that's what the U.S. side of the competition looks like. For their part, the PLA, not surprisingly, given what the Admiral said about their own concerns, the PLA seeks to ensure that no hostile foreign military, especially that of the United States and its allies, can operate in the vicinity of China with impunity or intervene in PLA operations without taking on significant operational risk. So that's how I boil down this competition, and everything else is detail, from doctrine to weapons to force posture. So let me add that more broadly, the PLA, along with Beijing's assertive employment of other elements of national power, has catalyzed concerns, reactions, and responses amongst other nations, not surprisingly, and not just in the region, but globally, given the vital national interests that many countries have in the Indo-Pacific. And it's not clear, by the way, that these reactions and responses to Beijing's activities, mostly negative of late, were anticipated by Beijing. And one only has to read the official documents of various countries to understand the profound concern that other countries have. Of course, you know, I took a moment to look at Ottawa's 2022 Indo-Pacific strategy, and more recently, the defense document, Our North, Strong and Free, a renewed vision for Canada's defense. And there are some really key issues in there that are emerging that perhaps wouldn't have been in Canadian strategic documents previously. So let me close by saying that while I'm one of those people who are not a specialist on U.S.-Canada relations, it does seem to me that Ottawa and Washington are increasingly strategically aligned on China, at least on the need to assert ourselves in the region to uphold international norms, and especially to work together on the military-maritime dimensions of international norms. The Admiral referred to the RCN's presence in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, the idea that the two navies, the U.S. and Canadian navies, are doing combined Taiwan Strait transits. That's huge. And that has a huge impact on Beijing. And whether the Canadians, you know, operating in exercises such as Noble Wolverine or on RIMPAC, that's really leaning forward relative to the past. So if there's one area where I think there could be more cooperation between the U.S. and Canadian militaries, if it's not going on already, is perhaps in assisting the countries of Southeast Asia to enhance their maritime domain awareness capabilities so that they have a better situational picture of all of the potential illicit maritime activities, which are not just about the PLA. It's about illicit and illegal fishing and pollution, et cetera. So I think having more than just an American presence in Southeast Asia to help them with their maritime domain awareness would be a very, very positive contribution by the Canadians. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, David. You raised so many great points, but this whole idea of the changing nature of conflict with China and that military dimension, and also the changing nature of war is a really great segue into talking about technology competition. I'd like to turn to you, Janice, to talk about some of this idea of competition to promote and protect advanced technology.
Thank you very much. And let me just say what a privilege it is to be with Vice-Admiral Topshee. Long been an admirer. And it's really nice to hear Canadians say we admire our leadership in our forces.
I really feel this should be the other way around.
And great to be with you as well. Let me just say that I have taken Vince's injunction seriously. But I'm going to start by saying something about the U.S.-China relationship, and I'm going to bring it home and say, what does this really mean for Canada? Let's just start with just a little levity, David. When you said it is huge that we have a frigate doing Taiwan Straits patrolling, I said to the Admiral, to myself, huge? It's having a huge impact on Beijing. I'm not sure it's huge. He quietly nodded, but didn't incriminate himself in any way there. So again, I'm going to say that I think some modesty is always appropriate when we think about our role and how we can contribute. I want to take just a step back and talk a bit about technology. It wasn't on the official list, Vince, but it is such an important background. And I'm going to be very careful because I'm here with three people with decades of expertise in naval warfare. So you're going to correct me if I've got this wrong. Everybody in this room is aware that we are in the midst of at least 3, 4 intersecting technological revolutions that are moving at just an unbelievable pace, frankly, when you get close to it. I come from a city where the leaders of this revolution are Jeffrey Hinton, and Montreal is Georges Bengio, and others. And when you see what's going on, you walk away stunned, frankly. The first of these is AI. We've already seen AI deployed on the battlefield in the last year in limited ways, but nevertheless surprising. We are in the midst of a revolution on synthetic biology, which, just think about that. We're in a revolution on intelligence. We're in the midst of a revolution on manufacturing life. That's synthetic biology. And we're in the midst of a revolution on material science, which will manufacture matter. So you think that we are looking at a period, decade, where we will make progress in all three. That's everything there is in the universe: life, intelligence, and matter. We've never really been here before, frankly. And we can't predict. None of us, none of us. And the scariest part of it all is the people who are leading these revolutions cannot explain why they're getting the outcomes that they're getting. And that's why you're hearing the kind of panic in the voices of the very people who created the technology. So what does it have to do with the Indo-Pacific and US-China and Canada-US? When I look at this, I take away two early points of observation for the next 10 years. One is there is asymmetry, and we're seeing this in some of the battlefields. We're seeing drones, $50,000 drones take out very expensive tanks. And I'm sure Vice-Admiral Topshee has been watching with absolute astonishment what the Houthis have been able to do with missiles, and branching forward into what this will do. A very senior American naval commander just said to me 10 days ago, aircraft carriers have a shelf life of 10 years. So while the Chinese are busy making them, this may be the most incredibly expensive toy that gets thrust into the attic closet within a decade. And it's in that context that I think it's very important not to focus only on capabilities, but to understand what those will look like in a very, very different world, and also to marry them with a kind of, I think, very appropriate analysis that you provided us. We don't know intentions, frankly. The second is that this revolution is going to be very, very challenging to manage for military leaders because it's moving so fast. And military planners have a long time horizon to plan. And that time horizon, I'm going to talk about that in terms of implications for us, that time horizon makes it very, very difficult to stay apace with this quickly evolving revolution, which is also diffusing power, right? And that it takes a state to manufacture an aircraft carrier, and it takes a big, powerful one. That's not true for the far cheaper means of technology that are now diffusing, which will be able to take on some of these very, very expensive investments that we've made. So I want to make really the first comment about Canada. We have to do something in this country about aligning procurement with the pace of the world we're living in. And it's not rocket science, but we just haven't done it. And to give you an example, where could we work together? So I'm going to get very concrete here. Pentagon has opened a portal. 2 minutes, she said, but I'm going to take more. The Pentagon has opened a portal and put $1 billion in it to work with its venture community because it has recognized the implications of what's coming. We have not done that in Canada. There is no reason why we can't do it. That's all I can say. I've asked repeatedly. The next comment is even more controversial. We've cut off scientific communication and exchange with Chinese researchers, both in the United States and in Canada. Well, what does that really mean? We now know far less than we did 5 years ago where China is in every single one of these key revolutions that's going to shape our society. Now, there's no good choices here. There's no easy choices. But I want to put on the table, we have willfully blinded ourselves. And for anybody who's spent years in the CIA, we have plenty of examples of how we got it wrong because we didn't have access. During the Cold War, we never did that. We, in fact, kept scientific exchanges going with Russia throughout most of that period, and those were very useful for people. I want to put back on the table for reflection. Is this the wisest and most intelligent course that we've chosen? 3, the story about Chinese technology, AI, quantum, but particularly AI and robotics, is all about this is designed, so there's an imputation of intention. This is designed by China to outpace the United States. This is made in China. China, and Xi Jinping has said, by the way, if you read his words, he has said China intends to outpace the United States in advanced technology. But as Tony Blinken just said, don't pay attention to the words, watch the deeds, right? What's missing from this story is that this is a fundamental domestic imperative for China. Its population is peaking. No one, we can argue about which year it's peaking, but it's peaking. And there are estimates from reliable demographers that the United States and China will be the same size by the year 2100. There is no doubt that there's going to be a worker shortage. China's only chance at being a genuine middle power in terms of its economy, its only chance is if it can advance, and through using things like robotics and AI, it can move up the value chain and compensate for its declining population. Because for sure, it's not going to be consumption that pushes the Chinese economy up, and there is a limit to export surges into the rest of the world. We have to balance, at the very least, when we're trying to draw inferences, the story of Chinese technology, and we have to know far more about it than we can from the sources that we have. I feel sorry for the CIA some days, I really do. The last thing I want to say is we've lived through, ever since Donald Trump and right through the Biden administration, a history of sanctions, tariffs, and embargo, right? And we're part of this because if anything any of our companies export has even a tiny component of what is identified as advanced technology, it gets caught up in a supply chain. So this is really a global policy. Let me just give you one example of the dangers of doing this, and it's not new. At the forefront of this has been chips, as we all know. China surprised everybody last year when Huawei and SMIC showed that they are able to mass produce, that is their plan, but they certainly showed the capacity to do it, a 5 nanometer chip. The smaller it is, the better it gets with chips. Let me just put it that way. The estimates that, people thought it would take, if at all, it would take forever for China to get into the more advanced realm. What we've really seen as a result of the ban on chips, because that is a fundamental driver of a technologically advanced economy. Every single one of you has one. It's in your phones right now in front of you, every one of you. If you're shut out of access to very advanced chips, that's the end for an advanced economy. What do these export bans and embargoes do? Trying to redirect massive investments into a competition inside China to develop these chips. Now, that is not an efficient way to deploy capital, but when you're deploying capital en masse that way, something will work. Is this, and in line with your comments, Vice-Admiral Topshee, is this the wisest strategy for all of us to be pursuing when in fact the intentions are still ambiguous? Where do we open the space for collaboration on advanced technology, or is it completely closed? Vince, I think that's an area for Canada to explore, and with our American partners together.
Thank you. So you raised so many great points, Janice, and of course, I'm also thinking about competition amongst like-minded countries in developing technologies as we see this adaptation of industrial policies, especially in critical technologies like semiconductors. And the technology revolution has really defined technology as a strategic asset. And I want to turn to Travis. We've talked a great deal about national interests and perhaps the overlap between economic interests and national security concerns. But I'd like to turn to you to talk about the interest of non-state actors, especially the private sector, which of course is the driving force for developing advanced technologies. And I'm hoping you might give us an overview of how businesses are assessing the growing geopolitical tensions and how they are taking action to mitigate the impact it would have on the flow of capital and resources.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. When I thought about this question, there's a number of different contexts you could put it in, and the way that I thought I would try to frame it today is what I'm hearing from the private sector about kind of their views of the potential for a conflict with China in the South China Sea or over Taiwan. There are a number of risks that businesses face every day in engaging with China, doing operations in China. This is a relatively new one. During my career in government, I was at times occasionally asked to go and talk to leaders in the private sector about the risks associated with China, the risk to their intellectual property, the risk to their trade secrets, the risk to their talent, even the risk of business travel to the PRC. And yes, often talking about the risk of research collaboration. Be happy to compare notes on that as well. But it was pretty rare. In my current role in Strider, I get to have those conversations every single day. That's my bread and butter. However, until recently, I cannot think of a single time that I ever had a business leader or an investor ask me about the risks of armed conflict over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. It may have happened, but I don't recall ever. That has changed. It has changed in the last 2 years, and it's changing rapidly. A growing number of business leaders and investors are becoming increasingly concerned over that prospect, over the prospect of a conflict between the U.S. and China. And I would note these are not business leaders and investors just in the United States. I'm engaging in this conversation in many places, including here in Canada, and I just a couple weeks ago was in Tokyo as well. Several factors are driving that change. I'm going to focus my remarks today on Taiwan and to a much lesser degree the South China Sea. However, this new concern was in large measure sparked by events that were not directly related to the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. The first was COVID-19, and the second was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As disruptive as that pandemic and Russia's invasions were, there is now a growing understanding that a conflict with China would be even more disruptive, even more traumatic. I'm often asked about the economic cost or impact of a conflict over Taiwan. When I'm asked that question, I always say the exact same thing. I am not an economist. There's a room full of economists here, or at least there are many of you. I'm a former Marine, an intelligence officer, and this is a dangerous place for me to be. But Bloomberg helped me out. They came out with, I think, a fairly strong modeling exercise in January that estimated the cost of a war over Taiwan would be 10 trillion US dollars. That's about a 10% hit on global GDP. The report predicted that China's GDP would fall by 17%. Taiwan's GDP is essentially wiped out. Canada's GDP took a hit of around 8%, and the US around 7%. The biggest factor driving the GDP loss for all parties concerned was semiconductors, which I think everyone here knows Taiwan plays a huge role in producing. For most Americans, however, until recently, Taiwan was an issue that was kind of viewed as an artifact of the Cold War, right? An irritant in the bilateral relationship that needed to be managed, but not something that was likely to start a war. That view is changing. The general downturn of Sino-US relations in recent years, the PRC's reaction to then Speaker of the House Pelosi's visit to Taipei in August 2022, the spy balloon incident in early 2023, all combined to make the potential for a conflict with China a reality for Americans. Today, a majority of Americans now view the PRC as a threat, not just a competitor. That is a change. I would argue the balloon had a lot to do with it, which is fascinating. In Washington, China hawks can be found across the political spectrum. And indeed, the most successful bipartisan committee in Congress is one that was formed to examine the threats posed by the PRC. Officials in the US, in the PRC, and in Taiwan have begun to voice a sense of urgency and raise the prospect for a conflict in the near term. In February 2023, CIA Director Burns stated that the US knew, quote, as a matter of intelligence, that Xi Jinping had ordered the PLA to be ready to conduct an invasion by 2027. Taiwan's foreign minister last year warned that an invasion by China was, quote, more likely in 2027. And several senior US military officials have said that such a move could come even before then. Xi Jinping's predecessors were willing to wait for eventual reunification. Xi is not. He has called the issue a historic mission that cannot be passed down from generation to generation. Now, some analysts assess that domestic economic problems will restrain Xi, at least for the near term. However, in my view, the structural realities of the Taiwan issue and the PRC's increasing pressure tactics seem bound to lead to further escalation. When that happens, the US may decide that it needs to respond vigorously. Like it or not, contesting Chinese coercion is now viewed as an important way to measure US resolve. In January, Taiwan elected Lai Ching-te as the island's next president. Xi Jinping probably is worried that the Democratic Progressive Party's third consecutive term signals a continued drift away from unification. That perceived drift is dangerous. That perception of a drift is dangerous because increasingly the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy rests on the claim that it and it alone is the guarantor of China's sovereignty. It's also very important to understand that Beijing has already begun to use the PLA to put pressure on Taiwan. In August 2022, the PLA conducted unprecedented exercises following Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. The PLA did so again after Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen visited the US in March 2023. Those exercises are prime examples of what some analysts have called gray zone warfare. These are operations designed to intimidate the island, wear down its defenses, and, when the PRC chooses to do so, disrupt commercial airline and maritime traffic. For decades, the median line that ran down the middle of the Taiwan Strait, or that runs down the middle of the Taiwan Strait, effectively separated the two militaries. Today, that median line is gone. It does not exist, at least in terms, as far as the PRC is concerned. PLA air and naval operations around Taiwan and incursions across that line and into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADEZ, have become the norm. They happen nearly every day. Last month, the PLA sent some 157 aircraft into Taiwan's ADEZ. More than 100 of them crossed that median line. I don't know how many of you ever heard about it, but it's happening. The PRC's use of gray zone tactics raises very difficult questions for government policymakers and for military leaders. When does a military exercise constitute a blockade? Who is responsible for responding? What options does the US and Taiwan have to respond? It is true that the US and China have taken steps in recent months to stabilize relations. However, tensions could reignite with little or no warning. I mentioned the PRC sends military aircraft. They now routinely cross the median line, and the PRC naval vessels, military aircraft, and maritime law enforcement assets are operating around Taiwan on a regular basis. Taiwan often responds by sending its own aircraft and its own naval vessels. The large number of these ships and aircraft operating in such close proximity raises the risk of a mishap or miscalculation. It is impossible for me to provide warning of when two ships or two aircraft are going to collide. I also cannot predict when a young pilot or a young ship captain is going to make a mistake or a misjudgment. However, I can provide warning when the conditions for such an event are set. I am providing that warning today. Frankly, in my assessment, it is a question of when, not if, such an event will occur. A similar dynamic is playing out in the South China Sea, as the Admiral noted a few minutes ago, right? Where the Philippines, a US treaty ally, is trying to resupply one of its outposts at Second Thomas Shoal, the PRC Coast Guard is harassing those attempts, often violently. When an accident or a miscalculation does occur, the potential for it to spark an escalating crisis is extremely high. It is extremely high because the political maneuver room, both in Beijing and in Washington, to de-escalate is extremely small. I mentioned a few minutes ago that the PRC's gray zone warfare tactics raise difficult questions for U.S. and Taiwan policymakers and for military leaders. This also holds true for investors and business leaders, and I'm hearing about it every day now, every week, not every day. What would a crisis or conflict mean for foreign businesses operating in Taiwan or in the PRC? What would it mean for businesses that rely on Taiwan-produced semiconductors? How likely is it that the PRC will seek to pressure foreign companies who do business with the PRC, or excuse me, with Taiwan? What form could that pressure take? These are the types of questions that are beginning to shape business decisions. One of the biggest decisions I'm seeing is that a lot of investing in lobbying. Government affairs offices and in these large corporations, at least, are trying to get a lot of China experts to go in and lobby to try to shape U.S.-China policy and legislation. Some businesses are choosing to forego new investments or expanding operations in the PRC. Some businesses are developing plans for a range of contingencies that consider events that would trigger the movement of personnel, capital, and infrastructure in the region. And some business leaders and investors have begun to look past the current status quo and ask themselves what eventual unification, either violent or nonviolent, would mean for their interests. I'll close there. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you. So, David, I know that you had a two-finger.
Yeah, so thanks. Thank you, Travis, for, I think, capturing pretty faithfully some of the concerns on the U.S. side. I found it compelling, or at least comports with my experience. But I did want to respectfully address some of the potential eye-rolling over the idea that the Taiwan transit of the Canadian Navy was a huge event. And it was a huge event because it's not viewed by Beijing in isolation of the event itself. It's viewed as part and parcel of an attempt by the United States to internationalize the Taiwan issue, to take what had been for decades a bilateral or trilateral, if you count Taiwan issue, and internationalize it. So it may have been just a frigate that went through, a Canadian frigate that went through the Straits, but if you're a person in Beijing in their General Staff Department or Joint Staff Department now, looking at what's going on, they then think about the French Navy that went through. And oh, by the way, prediction here, you'll probably see a German frigate go through in the next year. And all of the joint statements that come out of Washington when a foreign head of state visits now speaks where it did not in the past to the desire for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and even NATO starting to put in its strategic outlook documents talk about Taiwan. So while in and of itself, the passage of one Canadian Navy frigate through the Straits is in itself not a huge deal, the lens, the prism through which Beijing refracts that one event is through the larger concerns they have about the so-called internationalization of the Taiwan event. So yes, I agree in itself it was not a huge event, but in a larger strategic context, as viewed by Beijing as I understand it, it adds to the narrative of this internationalization and attempt by the U.S. to deter by united front and coalition any military plans the Chinese may have on Taiwan. Over.
So, David, I agree that the concern, you're right, of course, that the concern is with the internationalization. But that raises, again, a concern, frankly, when you get Canada, Germany joining, what's behind that? A signal is only meaningful if it's reinforced, in fact, by a willingness to commit greater forces in the event that this escalates, right? Because you're describing that it is reinforcing the sense of encirclement as these issues are internationalized. And again, I think we need a much more serious discussion than we've been having. It is all too easy to send a signal. The challenge really becomes, what do you do when your signal fails? And we often don't ask that question. The other issue, again, you talked about, and again, let me raise this for Canada and the United States, right? You know, when I was doing the work on the Indo-Pacific, I said Indo-Pacific oceans. This is a strategic problem of oceans. For the countries in Southeast Asia, the biggest issue is illegal fishing, all the way up and down the Pacific coast. It is a daily provocation. And if you're looking for incidents that can create miscalculation, that's it. Both of us have combined space and underwater sensing capabilities where we can tell somebody literally in real time when an identifying fishing vessel enters territorial waters. Would you rather, for the Americas, would you rather that Canada leverage those space and underwater sensing capabilities, which I know Vice-Admiral Topshee, and by the way, which is a joint private sector, public sector capability, which is quite remarkable in Canada. We leverage those and ramp that up as a contribution to Indo-Pacific security. When we brought that up, that was seen as an out of left field idea for this country. And again, thinking about where we're going with technology, is that where we should be making investments of scarce dollars, frankly? Is the frigate the most useful thing we can do, is what I'm asking. Because it's always trading off resources.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating thing about, well, since we're on the topic of Taiwan Strait transits to a certain extent, one of the challenges we face in the maritime domain is that international law is not something that is set in stone. It evolves and changes. And I really enjoy it when people come up to me and say, it's so great that Canada's been doing these Taiwan Strait transits for the last 1 or 2 years. And that's like, we've been actually doing them for several decades.
Yeah.
It's just the thing is that unless you put a news crew on board, most people don't notice, other than China. And the importance of doing them is our operations. We do a lot of operations around Korea as part of the sanctions enforcement. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll do a port visit in Vietnam or Singapore or somewhere like that. And the direct line from point A to point B is through the Taiwan Strait. It's an international strait. If we don't go through it, then we are acknowledging tacitly China's claim that that's internal waters and you're not allowed to go through there. And so it's a dilemma of, you can see it as a provocation, and so you have to carefully measure it. It's like, how do you balance all of this? You don't change international law. And one of the things that we have noticed in the region is that anytime our ships operate within 24 miles of the Chinese coast, they are very aggressively hailed and told that you are not allowed to be there. We are actually allowed. The contiguous zone from 12 to 24 nautical miles is an area where state jurisdiction extends to support enforcement of laws within the territorial sea. That has no other thing. So we are perfectly entitled to operate, as China is, up to our 12-mile limit. There's restrictions inside the exclusive economic zone about what you can do, but we have every right to operate there. If we don't, then we are creating an acknowledgement that China is changing the facts on the ground and that territorial seas could be expanding out to 24 nautical miles. There is a process to do that. So the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea and a renegotiation there. So all of this has to go into the calculation because we also don't want to just keep doing this blindly and create these provocations, because how do you make sure that what we intend in messaging is what is heard? Because communications is difficult enough between close allies like Canada and the US who speak a common language. When we start to introduce other languages, other systems, other perspectives, it becomes very difficult to make sure we clearly are articulating and communicating what it is we're trying to do, and that that's properly understood.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think I agree with everything you said, Admiral, and I would say the only thing I would add to that is it's never been more important than now.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think went overlooked by a lot of observers was that prior to that exercise in August 2022, the one in reaction to Speaker Pelosi's visit, and the months leading up to that, I think it was around June or July, the PRC announced that the Taiwan Strait is, quote, their territorial waters. They announced it through several different ways. They announced it officially and through the MFA, and they said it multiple times. If you think about that statement alone, you want to talk about a statement that that is sending message, that's a pretty strong message, right? The Taiwan Strait belongs to the PRC, it is PRC national waters. And that exercise, and I mentioned in August 2022, it had missile closure areas that overlapped with Taiwan's claimed territorial waters, with Japan's exclusive economic zone, in which the PRC fired missiles, right, over the course of several days. That's a pretty strong message as well. And so around the McCarthy, or excuse me, the exercise in 2023, the PRC announced that it was going to be doing shipboarding and inspection in the Taiwan Strait. Now, to the best of my knowledge, they didn't execute that, right? And Taiwan did the right thing, said we won't comply. The U.S. did the right thing. We shut up. We didn't say anything about it, right? But that's a very strong message. They are setting the stage to try to enforce PRC law, right, in the waters and territories claimed by Taiwan and the entire Taiwan Strait. So sending that message today is as important as it ever been, probably the most important that it could be.
And if I could add about the importance of messaging, from Taiwan's perspective, even though there is unprecedented international coordination and efforts to come to the defense of Taiwan, nevertheless, public opinion in Taiwan remains on shaking ground when it comes to U.S. commitment to actually act upon its commitments. We've seen, for instance, Congress, as part of its aid package to Ukraine and Israel, it also has over $8 billion committed to come to the defense of essentially Taiwan as part of the Indo-Pacific defense package. Nevertheless, about 80% of the Taiwanese in a poll that was done last November say that relations with China have worsened, and more concerning is the fact that 34% of Taiwanese only 34% of Taiwanese see the United States as trustworthy. And so when we talk about gray zone tactics, yes, there are many angles to this, but one is, of course, disinformation, and that the Chinese are incredibly effective in that. And so when we start talking about different tactics, we do also have to see that new angle, not just technology, but also the communication tactics. And finally, when we see the publicity around Canadian forces in territorial waters and airspace around Taiwan, that sends a signal to say that the international community is there in defense to protect Taiwan. So I think we should do more, not less.
See, I'm not sure that's correct.
Oh,
Because
okay.
we're here two different stories here, and it's worth pausing for just a minute. It's the same behavior you send a frigate through the straits. One is in defense of the law of the sea, and all that is implied by the law of the sea. That doesn't. There's a second one, which is we're internationalizing the conflict, as David put it. And that's an implicit commitment to come to the defense of Taiwan. Those are two very different stories that the same ship tells. Which inference you draw really matters.
Right. So
Yeah, let me say that internationalizing the issue, not internationalizing the conflict.
Yeah, but the Chinese are drawing the inference that it's internationalizing the conflict.
I would say that the most effective is to internationalize the protection of the rule of law, right? So but that's not necessarily always.
That's broad too. What Vice-Admiral said, it is reasserting the law of the sea.
Yeah.
That's narrow.
But this comes down to the difficulty of assessing intention, right? And so this very same action can be interpreted in a number of different ways. And how we operate in the Taiwan Strait can also be misinterpreted in other things. And China is very good, actually, at confusing things. We didn't help that. There was a couple of years ago, we did a Taiwan Strait transit. As the ship was going through, they happened to release a photo, because we were very slow about getting photos out, of them about a week before doing a swimming exercise where the sailors just stopped the ship. There was a big, giant inflatable unicorn, and that photo came out as the ship was going through the Taiwan Strait. China immediately said we'd stopped and done a swimming exercise with an inflatable unicorn in the middle of the strait, because they were which, believe it or not, I had to then spend time explaining to government, no, we didn't do that. Right? So we can have miscommunications within our own country about what exactly is going on. So that's why I think we've got to be really careful. We think the signal we're sending with these actions is really, really clear.
Yeah.
I don't know that it is, and we never know that unless, as Janice said, We have mechanisms to have dialogue with them, to hear that feedback somehow.
Yeah.
And we've cut almost all of those off right now. So I agree that there are risks. Every form of contact is an opportunity for them to gain an advantage, but it also is an opportunity for us to gain understanding. So finding the balance is the key.
A couple of points. I see we're about to go into Q&A, but number one, I think what this panel has underscored, or at least implicitly, is that there is today a battle for the narrative going on between China and other countries in the world. How do we interpret UNCLOS? What's legal? What's not legal? What does the UN resolution that allowed China to come into the UN really mean? What does the U.S. and other countries' one China policy as opposed to principle mean? So there's a battle for the narrative. And I think the Admiral is quite correct. We're having a lot of trouble having effective strategic communications both ways. It's not just on our side collectively, it's on the Chinese side as well, which is why I was very heartened when, as a result of the Biden-Xi summit in November 2023, the U.S.-China military relationship, which had been frozen since the Pelosi visit, was put back on track. And just in the last several months, you've had a secure video teleconference between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Liu Junli, director of the Joint Staff Department of the PLA. We've had the defense policy coordination talks in Washington between the PLA and the Pentagon. We've had a meeting just 2 or 3 weeks ago of the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, whose purpose is to deconflict and discuss unsafe intercepts. Sometimes it's useful and sometimes it's not. And just a couple of weeks ago, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, had a call with the new Minister of Defense, Admiral Dong Jun. So the good news here is that the two militaries are talking again. I think we should always be talking. It's better than not talking. So that's where I've always stood on this, which is why I continue to talk to the PLA and others. But I would also underscore the concern, and I think Travis sort of got to it, that on the Taiwan issue, the prospects for miscalculation in all three capitals are rising. The possibility of miscalculation in Beijing, the possibility of miscalculation in Taipei, and may I dare say it, the possibility of miscalculation in Washington as well. So we really are at a dangerous and dislocating point, which is why I guess all these business people are coming to get your great counsel and advice.
Yeah, and just a quick note on that. If I gave the impression that there is a flood of business running out of China, let me clear that up a little bit. Look, there is still money to be made in China, and there's still business to be made in China. There is still investment going into China. What I'm trying to get across is while we are not seeing a wholesale run for the exits, we are starting to see a more measured approach to this and people asking questions that they weren't asking before. And there has always been risks associated with business in China, right? The potential rewards for those have always been viewed as up here, right? As the risk has increased, right? And the potential rewards, right, with economic slowdown and everything else have come down. What you're seeing now is an inflection point among a lot of businesses where they're saying, wait a second, if these risks are rising in these areas here, right, and I perceive the potential reward over time coming down here, what are my options? And that's what's new.
And yeah, and I think the American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing just put out its survey last week. I spoke to them during their door knock in Washington, and there's they're not going to be leaving Beijing anytime soon, but contingency plans are being made and questions are being asked that never before had been asked.
So you've all been incredibly patient and just, yeah, and Taiwan is having a new president inaugurated on May 20th. And so one of the big challenges, of course, is going to be Taiwan being able to communicate with the PRC moving forward. I believe there are microphones. If you have a question, we would like you to go up to the microphone and state your name and ask a question, not opine too much. Thanks.
Thank you for the panelists for a very comprehensive presentation on the issues. I would preface my remarks with no analogy is perfect, but I'm going to use a few analogies, so I do apologize. But China is a place of contradictions. There's a famous battle in China, the Red Cliff, where one could argue, nefarious techniques were used to defeat Cao Cao by sending burning ships into his fleet. China has a large number of inland freighters, ocean freighters, coastal vessels in their Coast Guard, and also a huge fishing fleet. My concern is in a war that they're going to direct that towards your military capacity and create ethical risk and targeting risk and munitions risk. So I just wanted to understand what the strategy was there. But two observations in your presentation, and obviously coming off the Black Sea, where Sea-Doos are from Canada being turned into military drones for $250,000. Whether we have to look at our capacity, and I know the Canadian government committed to air drones recently, Esquimalt, whether drones is the part of the solution from a military perspective rather than expensive ships. And the third thing that was missing from the presentation is what is the proper engagement strategy to make sure that DPRK does not play a comparable but obviously dissimilar role to Belarus if there is a conflict, or to reduce the potential tension for conflict.
Great, thank you. Who would like to take that?
So a lot there. So drones absolutely are part of warfare now. I think one of the things that we can overestimate, though, the lessons of the conflict in the Black Sea, because that's a very littoral area. And once you get out into the high seas, it's a lot more difficult to really manifest a drone attack at range. But we are certainly watching with interest what Ukraine's doing. We're on the wrong side of the cost curve in just about all of these engagements, firing multi-million-dollar missiles at $10,000 weapons. So that's got to change, and there's a lot of work being done to figure out how we can do that. Directed energy weapons probably offer the most promise in the long term, but they're difficult to achieve for a variety of different reasons. And it gets into the other challenge of, historically, we've always wanted to try and take out the archer rather than shoot down all the arrows. But that actually creates its own problems, and I think we're seeing that with the Houthis. And if anything, Operation Prosperity Guardian has actually probably bolstered the Houthis' reputation within the region, funding, recruiting, and a whole host of other things. So it's really complicated, and many of these problems don't have an obvious solution. In fact, I would argue most of them do not have a military solution. We have military things that we can do to try and manage the situation, but not to resolve it. And then with respect to DPRK, they're an unpredictable actor in that part of the world. I think that they would look to take advantage of anything that was happening, but I am not directly concerned about their capabilities in a fight with China or something else. I think that what they would bring would be dwarfed by everything else. When it comes to the gray zone conflict, unpredictable, but unlikely to really act out overtly, I think, beyond token attacks and everything else. So it just highlights just how challenging that region is. North Korea has a border with Russia and with China and with South Korea. You're bringing together a lot of countries that have very deep strategic interests in that region into close proximity, and it just exacerbates the potential for miscommunication leading to conflict.
Just a couple of other points, if you may. So thanks for raising the issue of unmanned issues. If you go to some of the websites of key groups in the U.S. in Washington, such as the U.S. Naval Institute or the Air War College, you'll see that one of the debates going on these days in the U.S. is, what does the future Air Force look like? What does the future Navy look like? What percentage of it is manned? What percentage of it is unmanned? So these debates are going on right now. Thanks also for touching on the fact that China has arrived as a maritime power with a capital M, not just the N in naval. But if you take a look at who's building the most commercial ships, who has the largest merchant marine, who has investments in over 90 ports around the world, who has control, who produces the most containers for shipping, and which country is engaged in building cranes, the cranes that are necessary. I wouldn't be surprised if one of the cranes that are being used to get the Key Bridge out of Baltimore was made in China. I'm just guessing. I have no idea. So the real point is that it hasn't been since the Ming Dynasty in 1368 to 1644 that China was a global maritime power with a capital N, but it's there today, for good, better, or worse. It's the reality. Over.
Great, thank you. Yes, okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Joanne Wang, a political scientist at McGill. I have a question. Well, first of all, I really appreciate Admiral Topshee, very cautious approach to China without assuming, given its growing capacity, without assuming the intention. My question is about to you is the military restructuring inside China. So they changed the 7 military bases to 5 theaters a couple of years ago. There's some domestic reasons for that, for some power consolidation. But I'm curious from Canadian perspective whether this military restructuring has an impact in terms of military capacity for China. A question for Mr. Whitworth. I see the tension between China and U.S. and certainly the potential threat from the China's growing and more aggressive approach in the Taiwan Strait. My question is, last month, so Ma Ying-jeou, the former president of Taiwan, had a meeting with Xi Jinping. This was pretty significant because PRC never recognized Taiwan as an independent country. So in the past, the two sides meetings always party to party instead of president to former president. So therefore, this meeting was very significant. So I'm curious what you make of it.
Thanks. So with respect to the Chinese military restructuring, there are domestic reasons for what they're doing, but I think more importantly, it's a sign that they are really trying to figure out how they do joint operations, how they are able to integrate all of their aspects of military power together, because they look very closely at what we've been doing in the West, and in particular with the US military, and the strength of their ability to bring sort of all of the capacities of military power together. But it's a tough thing to do. In fact, the US military has struggled in many ways to achieve jointness. Congress had to mandate it at one point. And because you tend to, what you know, it tends to be what you do. And so I'm very familiar with the Navy. I tend to default to a naval solution to most problems. So they are trying to restructure to get after that. Again, it's really hard to assess the effectiveness of a military. You can evaluate, that looks like a really powerful ship. That looks like a really powerful aircraft. We thought that the Russian surface fleet was pretty capable until we saw the Moskva get sunk. Two big things about that. One, it's an air defense cruiser, so it is supposed to protect the rest of the fleet from the missiles that hit it. And second, in this day and age, missiles are not supposed to sink ships. The fact it sank indicates that their damage control is not as good as it should have been. Where we can evaluate Chinese military prowess is in their aircraft carrier operations, because you can measure how fast planes take off and land. And by that measure, they seem extremely capable and are developing carrier aviation at a faster rate than most countries. But the indicators for their submarine fleet aren't as good and things like that. So it's really, really hard to assess. But my view of what they've been trying to do is to create that integrated military effect across all of the domains of operation.
Yes, so if I understood your question correctly, it was basically what do I make about the Xi Jinping Ma Ying-jeou visit, right, in the wake of Lai Ching-de's victory just a few months ago. Not surprising, right, that the Kuomintang would want to maintain its party-to-party relationships with the CCP, that Xi Jinping and other senior leaders would want to convey this message as well, that they are open to having dialogue, so long as the dialogue is with an organization or a political party that's willing to do what would they consider to be the bare minimum for cross-strait negotiations, right, which is a recognition of one China, right, 92 consensus and all of the rest that go around that. I think that there is growing concern on the part of the Communist Party leadership that now that the Kuomintang have lost 3 consecutive runs at the presidency, that, as I think I mentioned in my remarks, it kind of cements this drift away in their view. That's only part of it, right? The fact that Taiwan's democracy continues to be very vibrant, it's one of the most vibrant democracies in East Asia, that combined with now another loss for the KMT, and the notion that perhaps if the KMT cannot regain the presidency very soon, that the prospects for negotiated settlement of the cross-strait issue are going away. One thing that definitely, there's 2 things that concern me about that. One is the PRC's, the CCP's efforts to try to use the Kuomintang and others to spread information, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, whatever label you'd like to put on it, that undermines confidence in the U.S. ability and willingness to defend Taiwan. We can debate whether or not the U.S. would be willing or able to decisively defend Taiwan, but the bottom line is that the CCP would like to have everyone in Taiwan believe that we are either not willing or not able to undermine that confidence. And the other thing that concerns me is this. I have long assessed that so long as any PRC leader assessed that the window for resolving the cross-strait issue was open peacefully, or was open to peacefully resolving this issue on Beijing's terms, they would not use force. Xi Jinping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, as long as they assessed that that window was open to resolve the issue peacefully, they would not use force. That's been my assessment for a long, long time. I'm worried now because Xi Jinping, as I mentioned in my remarks, seems to be in a hurry. He is conveying a sense of urgency about this issue that I have not heard from previous leaders. And he has not, apparently not chosen anyone to succeed him, at least not yet. There is no senior leadership cadre of retired party leaders to guide him. He's on his own, and he wants it that way. And if he can't trust other people in the system to take on hard things today, or get them ready to take on hard things in the future, he may come to a conclusion that Taiwan is something that only he can resolve. Now, does that mean that he wakes up one morning and says, go time? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that my long-held assessment about what would cause a use of force, right, is now being tested.
Just one final comment to make, which builds. I agree with you that leaders in a bubble are the ones we should worry most about that, and especially if they feel they're running out of time. Just one final comment to add to what Vice-Admiral Topshee said. Chinese Navy and Army are largely untested. They are not tested in battle, right? Just remember that. We make huge errors in overestimating and underestimating military capability until the only real test is in battle. The Russians have just discovered this. The Iranians discovered this 3 weeks ago. This was the first test, and frankly, it failed for them for reasons that they are now learning. I think we just have to remember that the Chinese have not gone to war, fortunately, since 1979, and all of this, the capacity to operate in a joint, integrated way. The Ukrainians struggled and failed to learn despite intensive American advice. Only real test comes when you commit your forces to battle. So we really, the honest answer I would give, we do the best we can, but we don't know. It's important to remember that.
So with that, those words of caution, I would like to bring this discussion to an end. Thank you so much for being part of this. Thank you to our panelists. Let's move on.